Welcome to COM 4740 Intercultural Communication. This is the lecture on Chapter 3, Culture, Communication, Context, and Power. In this chapter, a lot of the focus is on how we learn our culture. How do we learn the behaviors and speech patterns and ways of thinking that are part of the culture of which we are a member? And one of the ways that we do this is by learning social scripts. Social scripts are a set of behaviors that we ascribe to certain activities. So think of a television script or a movie script, but apply that to everyday life. So for certain events like going to a wedding or celebrating a birthday or celebrating a graduation, we have a certain set of behaviors that if we're a member of that culture, we know that we're supposed to enact, okay? So for an example, let's use the social script of attending a wedding in the US, in America. We know what different roles people are going to play. We expect there to be a bride and a groom and the parents of those people and a best man and a maid of honor and bridesmaids and groomsmen. We know what the cast of characters is. We know what the sequence of events is going to be. If you're attending a traditional church wedding, you probably expect that someone will ask you if you're a friend of the bride or the groom and seat you on a particular side. You know that there will be music. You know that the bride will walk down the aisle. Clothing, we expect certain types of clothing to be worn by both those taking part in the ceremony and the guests. Food, we often expect there will be some kind of food, if nothing more than a piece of wedding cake. And there are a lot of other traditions, like a first dance between the bride and groom or the bride and her father, things like that. So we have a social script for attending a wedding. We have lots of others. Think of the social script for going out to dinner in a fancy restaurant. You might expect that you need to make a reservation, and when you get there, you're going to stop at the front and talk to a host and give them your name, and they're going to look up your reservation, and then they'll say, "Follow me to a table." They'll lead you to a table, they'll give you menus. You might expect that your drinks order will be taken before your food order. We know that we pay at the end of the meal. All of those behaviors and activities are part of the social script that we learn for going out to dinner in a nice restaurant. So these learned patterns of behavior are an important part of our culture, and outsiders don't always know them the way we do. Think about the social scripts that you know and how you learned them. Were they specifically taught to you? Did you learn them through observation or experience, or maybe some combination of those things? Now, to use the wedding example, if you served as a flower girl or a ring bearer when you were a small child, you might have been taught. Your parents might have sat you down and said, okay, this is a wedding and this is your role and this is how you are going to behave and this is the order of events that are going to happen today. So you might have been specifically taught. You might have learned through direct observation from attending a lot of weddings or seeing them on television. You might learn from experience. I know some people who've said that the very first wedding they ever attended was their own, so that can happen too. But we usually learn these things through a combination of these methods. Now ask yourself, do you expect an implicit understanding from the other people who are members of your culture? For example, if someone is an American, do we expect them to understand the same social scripts that we do? And the answer is usually yes. We expect them to have an implicit understanding of those. We kind of take that for granted. So what if it's not there? What if the person doesn't know the social script when you expect that they will? you're probably going to attribute motives to their behavior and think that they're being rude or they're deliberately not following the process, when it's possible that they don't know it or have never been taught it. Ask yourself, what are some of the symbolic meanings in these scripts, and if there is evidence of power at play. Symbolic meanings, think about when you do go to a restaurant and the host leads you to a seat, it's as if you're a guest in someone else's home in a sense. There's a symbolic meaning to even that role being called host and them leading you to a table and waiting on you. It's as if you're a guest and someone else is taking care of you. And those kind of businesses will often call their customers guests or refer to them that way. Evidence of power is an interesting one to examine. In the traditional American wedding, we often see the bride's father walk her down the aisle, and the officiant will say, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" The father will often say, "I do," or "her mother and I do." And then in many settings, the father will place the bride's hand into the hand of the clergy person, who then places her hand in the hand of the groom. And all of this is rooted in very ancient ritual, as it's symbolic of a transfer of property. She's the property of her father, and she is being transferred to the custody of her husband. That is the traditional meaning of that passing of the hand, or saying, "Who gives this woman?" If you dig deeper into the wedding ceremony, there are a lot of traditions like this. The sharing of the wedding cake is actually based on a fertility ritual. It's meant to symbolize fertility and prosperity and plenty. The wedding dress, while it's a different color in different cultures, it's usually quite expensive and elaborate, and that has traditionally been a way for the bride's family to show off their wealth. Even bridal showers, where the bride is given gifts for setting up the home, are a form of dowering the bride, giving her a dowry. So there are ancient rituals behind a lot of these traditions, and there is symbolic meaning in our social scripts that is really quite interesting to unearth. A lot of times we keep going through those routines and rituals without knowing what the traditional roots of them are. Recall that in the last chapter we talked about three perspectives, or three lenses, through which we can study intercultural communication, and that those were the social science, the interpretive, and the critical perspective. We're going to continue to use those three perspectives throughout this course, and we'll be applying them to different ideas. So they're like different pairs of glasses we put on to look at ideas in three different ways. So if we're thinking about this idea of how do we learn culture, or how do we learn these social scripts, we can take these three different perspectives on how it happens. The social science perspective, remember that's the traditional one, would assert that culture is learned and shared, and that culture influences communication. So the idea here is that someone teaches it to us and then we teach it to others. The culture is a specific thing and it influences the way we communicate, and we learn it and share it with others. The interpretive perspective would agree that communication about culture and social scripts is learned and shared, and that culture influences that communication. But the interpretive scholar would add a feedback loop and say communication also reinforces culture. So not only do we learn it and teach it to others, but we ratify it, we reify it, we strengthen it through the act of practicing it over and over again. The critical scholar would say that culture is a site of contested meanings and that communication reshapes culture. What that means is that we as a society kind of fight over what things mean in our culture. That's what contested meanings means, that we argue over it, that we're constantly remaking our culture, remaking our social relationships, and that communication plays a part in reshaping our culture. We're going to examine each of these at more length in the following slides, so don't worry if you didn't get a comprehensive view of it here. We're going to take a deeper dive right now. Let's start by examining the social science perspective in a little more depth. Remember, the social science perspective is that culture influences communication, that systems influence individuals. So if you look at the little circle over on the right-hand side here, you can see that the system is at the top and it's influencing the individual. So this idea is that culture influences us. It influences the way we think, the way we talk, the way we behave. So it's kind of an idea of programming of the mind, that our minds are programmed to the culture that we are part of, and that patterns of perception are passed on to us. Remember, we are taught and then we teach others. And one way of examining this perspective, some tools that will help us understand it better, are Hofstede's value orientations. These are presented on page 108 of the book, but we're going to talk about a few important ones right now. If you've had communication courses before, especially an interpersonal course or a theory course, you might have encountered these ideas before, Hofstede's value orientations, and these refer to a value or a principle that the culture itself observes. Okay, so it's not the values of individuals, it's the values of the culture as a collective whole. And these exist on a continuum, so it's usually not black and white, one or the other, but it's somewhere on a line between the two. For example, power distance. In a particular culture, do you have high or low power distance? So picture a line with the word high at one end and low at the other end. Every culture falls somewhere on that line, maybe more toward the high end or maybe more toward the low end. Now, what do these mean? High power distance means a high distance from power. In other words, the average person is far away from power or far away from the seat of power. Low power distance means low distance from power, so the average citizen is close to the seat of power. How does this play out in life? Well, a high power distance culture would be one where, for example, there's a peasant and a king. The peasant is far away from the power. The peasant doesn't have the right to talk to the king, to question the king, to criticize the king. That's an example of high power distance. A more modern example would be, I had a friend who was studying in Belgium at a college there, and she said the professors don't hold office hours, they don't interact with individual students. You go to lecture, you write down what the professor says, and that's about the extent of your interaction with them. And if you were to say that you didn't understand something, the professor would take it as a criticism of their teaching and think you were very rude. That's high power distance, right? The average person in that culture, in academic culture, is far away from those who are in power over them, far away metaphorically from those in power over them. Low power distance is when you are close to the seat of power. So think of a democracy. In the US, we can criticize our president, and we can talk to people in positions of power over us, people who are, say, in the legislature. We can write them a letter to express our opinion. We're closer to power in our culture. And in a workplace setting or in a school setting, we take it for granted that we can approach our boss or our teacher and ask questions and even criticize them. That's low power distance. Make sure you understand the difference between these because they're easy to get the wrong way around. So high power distance means you're a high distance away from power. Low power distance means you're a low distance away from power. In other words, it's more democratic. Femininity versus masculinity is another one of these value orientations. Now, in this case, we're applying those ideas to a culture as a whole. So we're saying, is this a more feminine culture or a more masculine culture? Again, picture a line with the word femininity at one end and the word masculinity at the other end. And think about traditionally feminine or masculine attitudes and behaviors. According to Hofstede, every culture is going to fall somewhere on that line. So what makes a feminine or a masculine culture? Feminine cultures are cultures that focus more on collectivism and nurturing, caretaking, looking after children, the elderly, showing respect for others. Being collectivistic is one of the main points to femininity. Masculinity, on the other hand, refers to very individualistic cultures like our own. U.S. culture is considered very masculine. These are cultures where you're expected to be competitive, you're expected to look after your own individual success, you're expected to want to achieve and climb the ladder of whatever business or situation you're in. Those are all considered masculine attitudes and values. So the US is considered quite a masculine culture. You can probably imagine that some Asian cultures are considered very feminine, and a lot of them fall somewhere on that spectrum or on that continuum. Uncertainty avoidance is another one of these, and uncertainty avoidance refers to the tolerance for risk. So in US culture, we're usually taught that risk equals reward. You have to take a chance if you want to succeed. So we have a pretty high tolerance for uncertainty in general. We're taught that risk isn't a bad thing and it can lead to good outcomes. In some cultures, they're very reluctant to take chances and they're more apt to follow very traditional ways of doing things because they don't want to take a chance on doing something new. Long and short-term orientation. Does the culture think far into the future as they make collective decisions, or do they think about what's best for the short run? Whether a culture has a long or short-term orientation often depends on the age of that culture. We know there are cultures in the world like Roman culture that date back thousands of years, whereas American culture only dates back a few hundred years. So that has an influence on whether we take a long or short-term orientation also. We're not planning for decades and millennia into the future most of the time. We're thinking of what's going to help right now, what's going to boost the economy right now, what is going to serve the people right now. And Hofstede has a number of other value orientations that you might have studied before, such as chronemics. We're not going to focus on those in this chapter, but all of these have an influence over that monolithic idea of culture being something that exists and that exerts itself over us. So we've examined the traditional or social science methods saying that the system influences the individual. The interpretive perspective sees the system and the individual as being in a reciprocal relationship. In other words, there's a feedback loop. So the culture dictates that we should behave a certain way, and then the way we behave influences the culture. So it's kind of a circular pattern going on there. I'd like to call your attention to an idea of ethnography of communication, which is to examine how a culture behaves to determine what their scripts are. And a scholar named Dwight Conquergood, who has since passed away, examined verbal and nonverbal activities to understand the patterns and rules of cultures. And I wanted to introduce you to a couple of his studies so you can just get an idea how that would work. He had done one study with gangs where he would work among them and just watch the way they talked and the way they would use symbols, use gestures, would paint symbols on walls, and he would observe and write about it, and he would suss out what their social scripts were through this observation. And that was the kind of ethnography that he did. And he used this method really successfully with a tribe of Hmong people, H-M-O-N-G, in a refugee camp. And he was sent to this refugee camp by a U.S. organization. So he's coming in from the outside as a white man. And the people in this refugee camp had had many other white people coming in from outside who were sent by governments or missionary groups trying to tell them how to do things, okay? And there was some resentment because of that. They didn't like having an outsider come in and tell them how to do things. So Conquergood was not the first person to go in there, but he tried a different approach. He tried an approach of finding out what their scripts were and how they communicated with each other before he prescribed changes in their behavior. Now, the behavior that the organizations were trying to change was with hygiene. These people were in a refugee camp in close proximity without running water or proper bathroom facilities and things like that. And hygiene and disease started to be a problem. So here's, white people coming in trying to tell them how to practice good hygiene, and some of the things they were being told were not part of their cultural scripts. So it wasn't effective. So on the next slide, you're going to see an approach that Conquergood took that ended up being successful. So here's a picture of Dwight Conquergood in the refugee camp where he was working, and he's standing in front of a character that he helped create, and this character is called Mother Clean. Now, the way this came about, when he went to this refugee camp and was observing behavior and trying to figure out social scripts, he didn't come in with an agenda of his own. He didn't come in telling them they were doing things the wrong way. He wanted to see what their customs and social scripts were. And he discovered that they would have these parades and native dances that would involve these characters, like the one you see here. They were similar to Muppets. And they were really entertaining for the children, and the adults also loved these activities. So what he did in partnership with some of the officials of the refugee camps, so some of the Hmong people who were in charge, he partnered with them to try to figure out a way they could get the hygiene messages across to the population of the camp in a way they would accept. And together they invented this character called Mother Clean that you see here. And Mother Clean became one of the cast of characters in these parades and dances, and Mother Clean would give messages to everyone about how important it is to wash your hands or boil water before you drink it and things like that. And Mother Clean seemed to be the key to success. She was accepted because she was within their social script and within their traditions. And interestingly, Conquer Good went back years later and found out that Mother Clean still existed, which really pleased him. So the character was absorbed into and incorporated into that culture and into the social scripts. But the reason why that happened is because he understood that there is this reciprocal relationship between people and their culture, and he spent the time finding out what is the cultural script here, and then how can I perhaps add to or alter that cultural script in a way that will have that reciprocal influence on the culture and make a real positive difference. That brings us to the third perspective, the critical perspective. Remember that critical perspectives and critical thinking always involve looking at power, who has it, who doesn't, and what is the hierarchy within a society. So the critical perspective sees culture as a site of contested meaning. And you can see in the picture here, I have kind of multicolored static representing culture. We don't have arrows going this way and that in an orderly way. This is kind of a chaotic situation where we are metaphorically fighting over what certain things mean. That's what contested meaning means, that we're in constant and ongoing debate over what our cultural values are and which ones should be prioritized. Some examples would be, what does it mean to be a good American? That would be contested right now. Different political views would define that in different ways. What does it mean to care about public health or to do the best for public health if you're a political official? Again, that is contested territory right now that we're kind of debating and arguing over. We're trying to define what it means in our culture. So ask yourself, who gets to own these terms and decide what they mean? Is it the party in power? Is it the person who speaks with the loudest voice? Is it the group who engages in civil disobedience? How do we change what those terms mean? So you can envision culture as this ongoing, constant wrestling match over these meanings. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, recently passed away. She was known for her dissenting opinions and for being what many would consider very liberal or left-leaning in her opinions. But the court is a good example of contested meaning when you think about having an odd number of justices on the court and them deciding important issues and deciding what a certain law means or what a certain passage of the Constitution means. That's the definition of contested meaning right there. And they are engaged in wrestling with that contested meaning as part of their jobs in those employment roles. So we've looked at the traditional perspective that says culture influences us, the interpretive perspective that says culture influences us, but we also in turn influence culture, so it's a reciprocal relationship. And we have the critical perspective that says culture is a site of contested meaning. There are a lot of people in the arena with a lot of different ideas, and there's a constant grappling with what our cultural values should be. That ends the Chapter 3 lecture. Please read the textbook thoroughly, and we will see you in the next video.